The desperate wail pierced the stillness of Scottsbluff, Nebraska territory. 1867, carrying across the vast expanse of red rock and scrubland with a haunting clarity that made Thomas Keller's blood run cold. He'd been riding the outer boundaries of the Lazy K Ranch when the sound reached him, a child's terrified cry followed by a woman's frantic shout that echoed through Wildcat Canyon, transforming the peaceful afternoon into something urgent and terrible. Thomas pulled his horse to a stop, tilting his hat back as he listened intently. The late June sun beat down mercilessly as he strained his ears. There it was again, desperate, pleading, unmistakable. Someone was in trouble deep in the canyon, and from the sound of it, there wasn't much time. "Come on, Blaze," he urged his chestnut stallion, turning toward the sound and digging in his spurs. The horse responded instantly, powerful muscles bunching beneath Thomas as they galloped toward the canyon's edge. Thomas Keller wasn't one to mind other people's business. At 32, he'd learned the hard way that in the West, a man who kept to himself stayed alive longer. 6 years running the Lazy K had taught him to be cautious, especially after the war had left him with little more than nightmares and a pronounced limp when the weather changed. But some sounds changed everything, a child's cry being one of them. The terrain grew treacherous as he approached the canyon rim. Blaze picked his way carefully down a narrow game trail, hooves sending cascades of pebbles into the chasm below. Thomas leaned back in the saddle, giving the horse its head. Blaze was sure-footed, the best mount he'd ever owned, but even the finest horse had limits. "Easy, boy," he murmured as they descended deeper into the canyon. The walls rose on either side, casting long shadows across their path. Another cry echoed, closer now, mingled with sobs. The trail narrowed dangerously, barely wide enough for Blaze's shoulders. Thomas pushed on, the urgency of those cries spurring him forward. They rounded a sharp bend and Blaze suddenly reared, nearly sending Thomas over the edge. A rattlesnake slithered across their path, disturbed by their approach. "Steady," Thomas commanded, holding firm as Blaze danced nervously. The snake disappeared into the rocks, but the delay cost precious minutes. The cries had fallen silent, and that worried Thomas more than the screams. He pressed on, urging Blaze to greater speed where the trail permitted. The horse responded valiantly, lathered with sweat now as they descended deeper. 2 hours in, with the sun beginning to sink toward the horizon, Thomas heard a faint sound different from before. Not a scream, but a soft, continuous whimper. Blaze stumbled, recovering quickly but with a concerning tremor in his right foreleg. Thomas patted his neck. "Just a little further, boy." The canyon widened slightly, revealing a dried creek bed below. There, near a stand of stunted cottonwoods, Thomas spotted movement, a flash of faded blue fabric. He urged Blaze forward, but the horse faltered, sides heaving before sinking to his knees. "Damn it," Thomas muttered, quickly dismounting. Blaze had given everything, pushed beyond exhaustion. Thomas removed his saddle and bridle, knowing the horse needed rest. "Stay here, boy." With his Winchester rifle in hand, Thomas continued on foot, his old war wound making his gait uneven as he scrambled down the last portion of the trail. The whimpering grew louder, punctuated by a woman's soft, soothing words. "Hello," Thomas called out, approaching cautiously. "I'm here to help." The woman's voice fell silent. Thomas emerged from behind a boulder to find a makeshift camp, if it could be called that. A young woman crouched protectively over a small child, her body positioned to shield the youngster from danger. Her eyes widened at the sight of him, a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Don't come any closer," she warned, pulling a small revolver from the folds of her skirt. Thomas stopped, slowly setting his rifle down and raising his hands. "Name's Thomas Keller. I heard crying from up on the rim. I'm just here to help, madam. The woman studied him, her hand trembling slightly as she kept the revolver pointed in his direction. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dirt-streaked cheeks and dark blonde hair escaping a once neat bun. The child, a girl of perhaps 4 or 5, peered around her mother's skirts with wide, fearful eyes. "Are you alone?" the woman asked, her voice hoarse. "Yes, madam. Just me and my horse, who's given out about 100 yards back." Thomas kept his hands visible. "You're in a bad spot here. This canyon isn't safe." Something in his tone must have reassured her, because she slowly lowered the revolver, though she didn't put it away. "I'm Beatrice Zimmerman. This is my daughter, Sarah." Thomas noticed then what he'd missed at first glance. Beatrice's ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, an angry purple bruise visible beneath the torn hem of her dress. Nearby lay the broken remains of a wagon wheel, and farther up the narrow canyon, he could make out the shape of a dead mule. "We were trying to reach Scottsbluff," Beatrice explained, wincing as she shifted her weight. "The wheel broke, and when I tried to unhitch the mule to ride for help, he spooked at a rattlesnake, threw me off and bolted, then fell on the rocks." Her voice cracked. "That was yesterday morning." Thomas's eyes widened. "You've been here a full day." He glanced at the child, noting her pale, drawn face. "Without water, we had a canteen," Beatrice said defensively. "I've been rationing it." Thomas nodded, instantly understanding the situation. A woman and child, stranded in Wildcat Canyon without transportation or sufficient water, one of them injured. With the summer heat, they wouldn't have lasted another day. "I'd like to help you, Mrs. Zimmerman, if you'll allow it." Beatrice hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Please." Thomas approached, kneeling to examine her ankle. "Sprain or break? Sprain, I think. I can put weight on it, but—" She gestured helplessly. "Not enough to climb out of here carrying Sarah." "My horse needs rest before he can carry anyone," Thomas said grimly. "And night's coming. We should make camp, and I'll get you both out at first light." He didn't mention his growing concern about Blaze's condition. The horse had pushed himself hard, perhaps too hard. Thomas got to work immediately, gathering what meager supplies Beatrice had salvaged from her wagon and adding them to his own. He built a small fire, careful to keep the smoke minimal. Wildcat Canyon had been known to harbor more than just rattlesnakes. Comanche raiding parties sometimes used these canyons, though they'd been relatively peaceful since the treaty 2 years back. As darkness fell, Thomas shared his jerky and the last of his canteen water with Beatrice and Sarah. The little girl remained wary of him, clutching a worn rag doll to her chest and speaking only in whispers to her mother. "She's normally quite talkative," Beatrice apologized, smoothing Sarah's hair. "It's been a frightening ordeal." "No need to apologize. She's handling it better than most grown men would." Thomas fed another small branch to the fire. "If you don't mind my asking, what brings you to these parts, Mrs. Zimmerman? This isn't exactly traveled country for a woman and child alone." Beatrice's expression tightened. "I'm a widow, Mr. Keller. My husband, Daniel, died of fever last winter in Kansas City. We were heading to Scottsbluff to live with my aunt." She hesitated. "At least, that was the plan. I received word just before leaving that she'd passed as well." "I'm sorry to hear that," Thomas said sincerely. "So you're continuing to Scottsbluff anyway?" "I have nowhere else to go," Beatrice admitted. "I'm trained as a teacher. I thought perhaps the town might need one." Thomas nodded. "They do, as a matter of fact. Last schoolmaster left 6 months ago. Town council's been looking for a replacement." Hope flickered in Beatrice's eyes, the first genuine emotion beyond fear and exhaustion he'd seen. "Truly?" "Yes, madam. Town's growing. Lots of families with young ones." "Then we haven't come all this way for nothing," Beatrice whispered, more to herself than to Thomas. As the night deepened, Sarah finally fell asleep, curled against her mother's side. Thomas offered Beatrice his bedroll, which she accepted gratefully. He kept watch, his back against a boulder, rifle across his knees. "You should rest too, Mr. Keller," Beatrice said softly. "Thomas, please. And I've learned to sleep with one eye open, Mrs. Zimmerman." "Beatrice," she corrected. After a pause, she added, "Thank you for coming when you heard Sarah cry. Not many would have bothered." Thomas shrugged uncomfortably. "Anyone would have." "No," Beatrice said with quiet certainty. "They wouldn't have." Thomas didn't argue. They both knew the truth of the frontier, how easy it was to mind your own business, to pretend you hadn't heard, to avoid the complications that came with involvement. He'd done it himself, more times than he cared to remember. "Get some sleep," he said instead. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Dawn broke with a threatening crimson sky. Thomas had checked on Blaze twice during the night, and his concerns had grown. The horse was resting, but that foreleg was worse, a serious strain at minimum. He wouldn't be carrying double, that was certain. Beatrice awoke as the first rays of sunlight touched their camp. She immediately checked on Sarah, who still slept soundly, then turned to Thomas. "How's your horse?" she asked, reading his expression. "Not good," he admitted. "He pushed too hard getting down here. He'll be able to carry Sarah, but you and I will be walking." Beatrice nodded, attempting to stand. She swayed dangerously, and Thomas rushed forward to steady her. "Careful," he warned, one arm around her waist. "That ankle needs proper tending." "I'll manage," she insisted, but her face had gone white with pain. Thomas hesitated, then said firmly, "Wait here. I'll be back shortly." He returned to Blaze, who greeted him with a soft nicker. After checking the horse's leg again, Thomas retrieved some strips of cloth from his saddlebags and returned to camp. "I'm going to bind that ankle properly," he told Beatrice. "It'll hurt, but it'll help you walk." She nodded, bracing herself as he knelt before her. Thomas worked quickly but gently, wrapping the cloth tightly around her swollen ankle. "You seem experienced at this," Beatrice observed, gritting her teeth against the pain. 4 years in the Union cavalry teaches a man a few things," Thomas replied. "You fought in the war." "Yes, madam." "Joined up in '61, served until Appomattox." He tied off the bandage. "There, how does that feel?" Beatrice cautiously put weight on her foot. "Better, thank you." Sarah stirred then, blinking sleepily at the adults. "Mama, I'm thirsty." Thomas frowned. Their water situation was dire. His canteen was empty, and Beatrice's nearly so. The nearest reliable water was at least half a day's journey. "We'll find water soon, sweetheart," Beatrice promised, though her eyes met Thomas's with clear concern. Thomas packed up their meager camp while Beatrice helped Sarah prepare for the day. He fashioned a crude walking stick for Beatrice from a branch, then returned for Blaze. The horse struggled to his feet, clearly favoring his injured leg. "That's it, boy," Thomas encouraged, leading him back to camp. "Just need to carry the little one." He lifted Sarah onto Blaze's back, securing her with strips of cloth tied to the saddle horn. "Hold on tight to his mane," he instructed the wide-eyed child. "He's a good horse. He won't let you fall." Beatrice hobbled to her feet, leaning heavily on the walking stick. Thomas gathered what supplies they could carry, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and they began the slow, arduous journey out of the canyon. The ascent was brutal. The trail that had been challenging on horseback was torturous on foot, especially for a woman with a sprained ankle. Thomas helped Beatrice over the roughest patches, one arm around her waist, while leading Blaze with his free hand. The summer heat built quickly, and by mid-morning, all of them were suffering. "We need to rest," Thomas finally said, as Beatrice stumbled for the third time in as many minutes. They found a narrow shelf of rock that offered a sliver of shade, and Thomas helped Beatrice sit. Sarah was quiet, too quiet for a child her age, her face flushed with heat. Thomas gave her the last drops from Beatrice's canteen, which she drank greedily. "How much further?" Beatrice asked, voice raspy from thirst. "To the rim. Another 2 hours at this pace, to water. That's the problem." Thomas surveyed the terrain. "There's a spring about 3 miles east of where we'll come out, but it's 3 more miles we don't have water for," Beatrice finished. Thomas nodded grimly. "We'll make it," he said with more confidence than he felt. "Blaze knows the way to water. He'll lead us there." They pushed on, the heat growing more oppressive with each passing hour. Beatrice's limp worsened, but she refused to complain. Thomas found himself admiring her determination. He'd known seasoned ranch hands who'd have been whimpering by now. The landscape blurred into a haze of red rock and dust. Thomas lost track of time, focused only on putting one foot in front of the other, helping Beatrice when she faltered, checking Sarah's precarious perch on Blaze's back. The horse was struggling too, but continued forward with the steadfast loyalty that had made Thomas choose him from a dozen others 3 years ago. When they finally crested the rim of the canyon, the sun was directly overhead, beating down with merciless intensity. Beatrice collapsed, her legs simply giving out beneath her. Thomas caught her before she hit the ground. "Just need a moment," she gasped. Thomas eased her down, then checked on Sarah. The little girl's eyes were half closed, her skin hot to the touch. Heatstroke was setting in. "Change of plans," he said, decision made. "The spring's too far in your condition. My ranch is closer, just over that rise." He pointed to a distant hill. "We'll head there." "Can we make it?" Beatrice asked weakly. "We have to," Thomas replied simply. He lifted Sarah from Blaze's back, cradling her against his chest. "I'll carry her. You hold onto Blaze's saddle and let him help you walk." They trudged forward, each step an exercise in willpower. Thomas's leg ached fiercely, the old wound protesting the strain, but he ignored it. Sarah's head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing shallow. Blaze suddenly raised his head, nostrils flaring. He gave a soft nicker of recognition, and Thomas felt a surge of relief. They'd crossed into lazy K-land. "Not much further now," he encouraged Beatrice, who was barely staying upright. The modest ranch house came into view as they crested the final rise, a sturdy log structure with a covered porch and adjacent barn. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant Eustace, Thomas's elderly ranch hand, had kept the home fires burning in his absence. "Thomas!" A shout came from the direction of the barn as a stooped figure hurried toward them. "Good Lord, man! We was about to send out a search party." "Water, Eustace," Thomas ordered, not breaking stride. "Bring water to the house." The old cowhand took in the situation at a glance and hurried to the well. Thomas led Beatrice to the house, kicking open the door and guiding her to a chair before gently laying Sarah on the sofa. Eustace appeared moments later with a bucket of water and dippers. Thomas helped Beatrice drink first, small sips to avoid sickness, then tended to Sarah, dribbling water between her parched lips. "The horse needs tending," Thomas told Eustace. "4 legs strained bad." "And send Jimmy for Doc Peterson." "Already done," Eustace replied, surprising Thomas. "Jimmy rode for the doc when you didn't come back last night. Should be here soon." Thomas nodded gratefully, turning his attention back to Beatrice and Sarah. The little girl was more alert now, the water reviving her. Beatrice's eyes met Thomas's over her daughter's head, filled with wordless gratitude. The doctor arrived within the hour, his buggy raising dust as it approached the ranch. Thomas helped Beatrice into his own bedroom, where Doc Peterson could examine her and Sarah properly. He paced the main room, waiting until the doctor emerged. "They'll be fine," Doc Peterson assured him, closing his bag. "Mrs. Zimmerman has a severe sprain, not a break. 2 weeks rest should see significant improvement. The child is suffering from heat exhaustion, but she's young and resilient. Plenty of water and rest for both of them." "Thank you, Doc," Thomas said, relief washing over him. "They can stay at the boarding house in town," the doctor suggested. "Mrs. Miller always has. They'll stay here," Thomas interrupted. "It's my fault they are in this condition. I should have been more careful with my horse, made it down to them sooner." Doc Peterson raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "As you wish. I'll check on them again in 2 days." After the doctor left, Thomas sat at Beatrice's bedside while she slept. Sarah had been moved to a small trundle bed that Eustace had dragged in from the storeroom. Both mother and child were sleeping peacefully now, their immediate danger past. Thomas studied Beatrice's face, relaxed in sleep. She was beautiful. He realized something he hadn't properly noticed in the crisis of the canyon. Her features were delicate but strong, her hands those of someone who'd worked hard all her life. There was a quiet dignity about her that spoke of inner strength, of someone who faced life's hardships without breaking. As if sensing his gaze, Beatrice's eyes fluttered open. She looked momentarily confused, then remembered where she was. "Sarah?" she asked immediately. "Sleeping soundly," Thomas assured her, nodding toward the trundle. "Doc says you both need rest and water, but you'll be fine." Beatrice exhaled in relief. "Thank you for everything." "You're welcome to stay here until you're healed enough to travel," Thomas offered. "It's not much, but it's comfortable enough. I couldn't impose, it's no imposition. Place is too big for just me anyway." Thomas stood. "Rest now. I'll have Eustace bring you some soup when you wake." Over the next few days, Beatrice and Sarah gradually recovered their strength. Thomas arranged for Jimmy to ride into Scottsbluff to inquire about the teaching position, which was indeed still vacant. The town council, Jimmy reported, was eager to meet Mrs. Zimmerman as soon as she was well enough to travel. Beatrice spent her days resting on the porch, watching Sarah play in the yard under the watchful eye of Eustace, who had taken an immediate liking to the little girl. Thomas continued his ranch work, but found himself returning to the house more frequently than usual, drawn by the novel experience of having others there. One evening, as the summer sun painted the prairie in shades of gold, Thomas found Beatrice sitting alone on the porch, Sarah already put to bed. He joined her, offering a cup of coffee, which she accepted with a smile. "Your ankle seems better," he observed. "Much," she agreed. "Doc Peterson says another week and I can travel to town." Thomas nodded, inexplicably troubled by the thought. "That's good news." "Thomas," Beatrice said after a moment, "I don't know how to thank you properly. You saved our lives." "Anyone would have. Please don't say that again," she interrupted gently. "We both know it's not true. You risked yourself for strangers. You pushed your beloved horse to exhaustion. You've given us shelter and care when you had no obligation to do so." Thomas looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It was the right thing to do is all." "It was extraordinary," Beatrice insisted. "And I want you to know that Sarah and I will never forget it." The mention of their eventual departure hung between them, unspoken but present. Thomas was surprised by how much the thought bothered him. In just a short time, he'd grown accustomed to Beatrice's calm presence, to Sarah's gradually emerging personality as she overcame her initial shyness. "Will you be happy in Scottsbluff?" he asked abruptly. Beatrice considered the question. "I hope so. It's a fresh start. Teaching has always brought me joy." "It's a good town," Thomas said. "Growing, decent folks for the most part. And not far from here," Beatrice added, her eyes meeting his briefly before looking away. Something shifted in Thomas's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, not since before the war had hardened him. He stood suddenly, making some excuse about checking the livestock, and escaped to the familiar solitude of the barn. Blaze was recovering well, though he would need several more weeks before returning to full work. Thomas checked his leg, grateful for the mundane task to occupy his hands while his mind whirled with unfamiliar emotions. The days passed too quickly. Beatrice's ankle healed steadily, and Sarah blossomed under the attention of Thomas and Eustace, becoming a chatterbox who followed the old ranch hand everywhere, asking endless questions about horses and cattle. Thomas found himself seeking Beatrice's company in the evenings, sharing stories of his life before and after the war. She told him of her childhood in Ohio, her marriage to Daniel, their struggles during the war years. There was an ease between them that Thomas had never experienced with anyone else. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Sarah long asleep inside, Beatrice asked, "Have you always been alone, Thomas?" The question caught him off guard. "Since the war, yes. No family." "Parents passed before the war, no siblings," he hesitated. "There was a girl once in Illinois. We were to be married when I returned from the fighting." "What happened?" Beatrice asked softly. "She married someone else," Thomas said simply. "Can't blame her. The man I was when I left never came back." Beatrice's hand found his in the darkness, a gentle touch that sent warmth spreading through him. "I understand. Daniel changed too after his time in the army. It takes something from men, that kind of fighting." "Yes," Thomas agreed, grateful for her understanding. "It does." They sat in comfortable silence, her hand still in his, until the night air grew chilly and they reluctantly went inside. The day before Beatrice and Sarah were to leave for Scottsbluff, Thomas rode into town on ranch business. He found himself outside the office of Mr. Hargrove, the town's only lawyer and head of the school board. On impulse, Thomas entered, hat in hand. "Mr. Hargrove, might I have a word about Mrs. Zimmerman, the new teacher?" An hour later, he rode back to the ranch, his mind made up. He found Beatrice in the kitchen, packing the few possessions they'd salvaged from the canyon into a carpet bag that Mrs. Peterson, the doctor's wife, had kindly donated. "Beatrice," he said, suddenly nervous, "could we speak privately?" She looked surprised but nodded, following him onto the porch. The summer day was perfect, a light breeze making the heat bearable. "I spoke with Mr. Hargrove in town," Thomas began, "about your teaching position." Alarm flashed across her face. "Has something changed? Is the position no longer available?" "No, no," he hastened to assure her. "The position is yours, but there's a complication they hadn't mentioned to Jimmy." He took a deep breath. "The teacher's quarters won't be ready for at least a month. They're converting the old assayer's office and the work's behind schedule." "Oh," Beatrice frowned. "Well, perhaps Mrs. Miller's boarding house, it's full up," Thomas interrupted. "Gold Strike over in the Black Hills has every room in town occupied." Beatrice's shoulders slumped slightly. "I see. Perhaps we should delay our arrival then until the quarters are ready." "Or," Thomas said, his heart hammering, "you could stay here, both of you." Beatrice stared at him. "Here, but we've already imposed." "It's not an imposition," Thomas said quickly. "In fact," he swallowed hard, "I'd like you to stay, permanently." Beatrice's eyes widened. "What are you saying, Thomas?" "I'm saying this place hasn't felt like a home until you and Sarah were in it." The words came easier now, as if a dam had broken. "I'm saying that in just 2 weeks, you've become more important to me than anything has been in years. I'm saying I can't bear the thought of you leaving, even if it's just to Scottsbluff." "Thomas," Beatrice breathed, her voice trembling. "I know it's sudden," he continued. "I know you came here looking for independence, for a fresh start, and I'd never want to take that from you. You can still teach in town. I'll drive you in each morning and bring you home each evening. But please make this your home. make it our home. Tears filled Beatrice's eyes. Are you asking? I'm asking you to marry me, Thomas confirmed, taking her hands in his. I love you, Beatrice. I think I started falling in love with you in that canyon, watching how bravely you faced impossible odds for Sarah's sake. And every day since has only made me more certain. Beatrice was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. I never expected this, she whispered. When Daniel died, I thought that part of my life was over. Thomas's heart sank. I understand if it's too soon. No, she interrupted, squeezing his hands. It's not that, it's just unexpected, wonderful but unexpected. Is that a yes? Thomas asked cautiously. Beatrice laughed through her tears. Sarah adores you, you know. She asked me yesterday if we could stay here forever. Smart girl, Thomas said, hope rising. I'm fond of her too, very fond. You would be a father to her, Beatrice asked seriously. She needs that, deserves that. I would be honored, Thomas replied honestly. She's an extraordinary child like her mother. Beatrice stepped closer, her eyes searching his. Then yes, Thomas Keller, yes, I will marry you. Joy, unlike anything he'd ever known, surged through Thomas. He pulled Beatrice into his arms, kissing her with all the emotion he'd been holding back these past weeks. She responded eagerly, her arms winding around his neck. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. I promise you won't regret this. I know, she said simply. When you rode into that canyon, you weren't just saving us from the immediate danger. You were changing the course of our lives, of all our lives. Sarah's excited voice called from inside the house, wondering where everyone had gone. Thomas and Beatrice exchanged smiles. Shall we tell her? Thomas asked. Yes, Beatrice replied, taking his hand. Let's tell her she's home. They were married 2 weeks later in Scottsbluff's small church, with Eustace standing as Thomas's best man and Sarah serving as her mother's maid of honor, proudly scattering wildflowers before the bride. The entire town turned out for the occasion, curious about the new schoolteacher and her whirlwind romance with the reserved rancher from the Lazy K. Beatrice began teaching that fall, with Thomas driving her to and from town each day as promised. Sarah started school as well, though she often preferred to follow Eustace around the ranch after lessons, learning about horses and cattle with an enthusiasm that made the old cowhand beam with pride. The Lazy K flourished under their joint care. Beatrice's practical management skills complemented Thomas's knowledge of ranching, and within a year, they'd expanded their operation, adding sheep and more cattle. Thomas built an addition to the house, 2 more bedrooms, and a proper sitting room where Beatrice could entertain the occasional visitors from town. On their first anniversary, Thomas surprised Beatrice with a new wagon and a matched pair of gentle mules. So you never have to worry about being stranded again, he told her, kissing her soundly before the bemused eyes of Eustace and Jimmy. As if I'd ever let that happen, Thomas added, his arms around her waist. I'd still ride until my horse collapsed to find you. I know you would, Beatrice replied softly, but I'm not going anywhere. The seasons turned, the harsh Nebraska winters giving way to glorious springs and scorching summers. Thomas's nightmares from the war gradually faded, replaced by peaceful dreams of the future. Beatrice continued teaching, becoming a beloved figure in Scottsbluff, known for her kindness and determination to give every child a proper education, regardless of their background. Sarah grew into a confident young girl, equally at home on horseback or with her nose in a book. She inherited her mother's intelligence and her stepfather's quiet strength, a combination that made Thomas and Beatrice immensely proud. In the spring of 1870, their family expanded with the birth of a son, whom they named James Daniel Keller. Thomas, who had never imagined himself a father, discovered a depth of love he hadn't known he possessed. He spent hours simply watching the baby sleep, marveling at the tiny fingers and the perfect miniature of his own features blended with Beatrice's. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered to Beatrice as they stood over the cradle one evening, Sarah leaning against him, equally fascinated by her baby brother. "Our family is perfect," Beatrice corrected, her hand finding his. Thomas smiled, remembering the desperate cry that had carried across Wildcat Canyon 3 years earlier, the sound that had changed everything. How close he had come to ignoring it, to continuing his solitary existence, never knowing what he would have missed. "Yes," he agreed, gathering his family close. "Perfect indeed." Life on the frontier remained challenging. There were drought years and harsh winters, sickness and hardship. But Thomas and Beatrice faced each challenge together, their bond strengthened by the memory of that first desperate meeting in the canyon. By 1875, the Lazy K had grown into one of the most prosperous ranches in the Nebraska Territory. Thomas and Beatrice had added another child to their family, a daughter named Elizabeth, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. Sarah, now 12, had become her father's right hand on the ranch, showing a natural affinity for horses that surpassed even Thomas's skill. Scottsbluff grew as well, transforming from a frontier settlement into a proper town with a new school building where Beatrice continued to teach. The railroad finally reached them, bringing easier access to markets and a fresh influx of settlers. The untamed wilderness that had nearly claimed Beatrice and Sarah was gradually giving way to civilization. On summer evenings, when the day's work was done, Thomas and Beatrice often sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. Sometimes Thomas would catch Beatrice looking toward Wildcat Canyon, visible as a distant slash in the landscape. "What are you thinking?" he asked her once, following her gaze. "I'm thinking how strange life is," she replied. That moment of absolute terror when our wagon broke down, when the mule died, when I thought Sarah and I would perish, there was actually the beginning of everything wonderful in our lives. Thomas took her hand, his thumb tracing the simple gold band he'd placed there years ago. "I still hear it sometimes, you know, Sarah's cry echoing across that canyon in my dreams." "Not nightmares, I hope," Beatrice said, concerned. "No," Thomas assured her. "Not nightmares, just reminders of how precious this is, all of this." He gestured to their home, their land, their children. "How easily I might have missed it." "But you didn't," Beatrice said softly. "You heard and you came." "Best decision I ever made," Thomas replied, pulling her close. As the sun set over the Nebraska prairie, painting the land in gold and crimson, Thomas Keller held his wife and counted his blessings. From the depths of war's horror to the height of this perfect happiness, it had been a journey he could never have imagined. All because a child's cry had echoed across a canyon, and he had chosen to listen.